Sometimes the greatest mistake a man can make is realizing too late that the family he was searching for had already belonged to him. Rain painted silver lines across the windows of Adrian Kensington's black Rolls-Royce as the wedding motorcade crawled through Midtown Manhattan, just 11 blocks away from St. Bartholomew's Cathedral, where 400 guests waited beneath crystal chandeliers and white roses flown in from Italy that morning. At 37, Adrian had built everything a man was supposed to want. His billion-dollar investment firm dominated Wall Street. Financial magazines called him the future of American luxury finance. In less than 1 hour, he would marry Charlotte Beaumont, the elegant daughter of a media dynasty whose last name opened doors even money could not. Everything about the day was flawless. The Tom Ford tuxedo draped perfectly across his shoulders. The diamond wedding band rested heavily against his palm. Outside, Manhattan shimmered beneath the soft gray rain like a city made of glass and ambition. Yet none of it felt real. Adrian loosened his tie slightly as the car stopped at another red light near Lexington Avenue. The silence inside the limousine felt strangely loud, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the soft vibration of his phone filling with congratulations from investors, politicians, and friends who believed this wedding was the final step in building an untouchable empire. Then it happened. Across the rain-streaked window, standing beneath the faded awning of a small corner pharmacy, was a woman in a caramel-colored coat, holding the hand of a little girl while balancing grocery bags against her hip. Adrian's breath caught, so suddenly it hurt. Zariah Cole. 6 years disappeared in a single heartbeat. The city vanished around him. Her dark curls rested against her shoulders exactly the way he remembered. Her face looked softer now, touched by exhaustion and quiet strength, but her eyes remained the same eyes that once made him believe life could be more than boardrooms and balance sheets. Then the little boy beside her looked up toward the limousine window. Adrian froze. Gray eyes. His eyes. The same. Storm-colored eyes staring back at him from a child no older than 5. The little girl turned next, and Adrian felt the blood drain from his face because she carried the same eyes too. 2 children. Twins. Both looking exactly like him. The wedding band slipped slightly in his trembling fingers as the rain continued falling over Manhattan, and for the first time in years Adrian Kensington realized that destiny did not care about timing, power, or carefully designed futures. Sometimes it waited until the exact moment your life looked perfect before revealing everything you had truly lost. The light changed from red to green, but Adrian Kensington did not move. Behind him, impatient horns echoed through the wet Manhattan streets while rain continued sliding down the limousine windows in trembling silver lines. His driver glanced nervously into the rearview mirror. "Sir?" Adrian barely heard the question. Across the street, Zariah adjusted the hood over the little girl's curls before kneeling to zip the boy's small blue jacket against the cold October wind. The gesture was simple, tender, familiar. It hit Adrian harder than any business crisis he had ever faced because for one impossible moment, he could almost see another life unfolding in front of him. A life where those children had known his voice, where rainy mornings meant pancakes in a Brooklyn kitchen instead of conference calls in glass towers overlooking Central Park. The little boy suddenly laughed at something his sister whispered, and Adrian felt his chest tighten at the sound, because even from across the street the child's smile looked painfully familiar. His smile. The same crooked grin his mother used to kiss before private school interviews and magazine photos and years of carefully learning how to become untouchable. Zariah finally looked up. Their eyes met through the rain and traffic and 6 years of silence. Adrian expected anger, maybe bitterness. Instead, her expression carried something far more devastating. Sadness. Quiet, exhausted sadness from someone who had learned to survive disappointment long ago. The twins followed her gaze toward the limousine. The little girl tilted her head, curiously while clutching a stuffed rabbit against her chest. Adrian noticed the rabbit's ear had been stitched back together by hand. Something about that tiny repair nearly shattered him. His wedding phone alerts continued vibrating beside him. Charlotte had sent another message. "Everyone is waiting for you. The cathedral looks beautiful." Adrian stared at the screen without answering. Beautiful. The word suddenly felt hollow. His entire future had been built on beautiful things. Beautiful buildings. Beautiful headlines. Beautiful relationships designed for cameras and shareholders, and old money families who treated love like another business merger. Yet standing in the rain beside a pharmacy with 2 children holding her hands, Zariah looked more real than anything he had touched in years. A memory surfaced before he could stop it. Harlem. Winter. A tiny bookstore on Lenox Avenue 6 Christmases ago. Adrian had stepped inside to escape the snow during the worst financial quarter of his career, exhausted from pretending confidence in front of investors who smelled weakness like blood and water. Zariah had been sitting cross-legged on a ladder organizing poetry books while old jazz music floated softly through the store speakers. She smiled at him without recognition, without calculation, without knowing his last name. "You look like somebody carrying the whole world on his shoulders," she had said gently. Adrian remembered laughing quietly at the time. Does it show that badly? Only to people who know what loneliness looks like. Outside the limousine, Zariah gathered the twins close as the walk signal flashed. She turned away first, disappearing slowly into the rainy Manhattan crowd, while Adrian sat frozen beneath the weight of a wedding ring that no longer felt like a promise. It felt like a mistake. The cathedral bells began ringing in the distance as Adrian Kensington finally forced himself to breathe again. But every sound around him now felt muted beneath the roar of memories he had spent 6 years trying to bury beneath success and polished magazine covers. "Sir, we are running late," the driver said carefully. Adrian looked down at his reflection in the dark window glass, the tuxedo, the silver tie pin, the man the world respected. Yet all he could see was the younger version of himself standing inside a tiny bookstore in Harlem with snow melting onto expensive leather shoes, while a woman with warm brown eyes handed him a cup of coffee she had bought with her employee discount because she noticed he looked exhausted. Back then, Adrian had not yet become the cold billionaire newspapers worshipped. Kensington Capital was still a struggling investment firm operating from a rented office downtown, with overdue invoices stacked beside cheap coffee machines and analysts quitting every week under pressure. Every investor wanted certainty. Adrian had none. Then he met Zariah Cole. She worked evenings at Bellamy Books while finishing graduate school and somehow carried peace around her like candlelight in darkness. She listened more than she spoke. She laughed softly at things other people ignored. And for reasons Adrian never fully understood, she looked at him as though his worth had nothing to do with money. The memory unfolded painfully clear inside his mind now. A February night. Snow falling outside the bookstore windows while jazz music drifted through the quiet aisles. Adrian sat at the reading table reviewing financial reports with frustration tightening his jaw when Zariah approached, holding a poetry collection in her hands. "You keep staring at those papers like they betrayed you," she teased gently. Adrian smiled despite himself. "Maybe they did." She placed the book beside him. "Then read something that reminds you life is bigger than numbers." It was the first time in years anyone had spoken to him without wanting something in return. From that night forward, he kept finding reasons to return. Sometimes he bought books he never opened just to hear her talk about the city, her dreams, or the children she hoped to help someday through community education programs in Brooklyn. She made ordinary things feel meaningful. Street coffee tasted warmer beside her. Rain felt romantic instead of inconvenient. Even silence became something comforting rather than empty. 6 months later, Adrian rented a small apartment downtown instead of sleeping at the office. Zariah filled the shelves with secondhand novels and tiny plants that somehow survived despite his terrible habit of forgetting to water them. On Sunday mornings, she danced barefoot in the kitchen while making pancakes, and old soul music played softly through the apartment speakers. Adrian had never known peace could feel so simple. Then Kensington Capital exploded almost overnight after a major merger deal placed Adrian on the front page of every financial newspaper in America. Suddenly, there were private dinners, investors from London, television interviews, and old money families inviting him into rooms that once ignored his existence. The higher Adrian climbed, the colder the world around him became. And somewhere inside that glittering new life, forces far more powerful than either of them quietly began pulling their future apart. Success changed Adrian Kensington slowly, the way winter steals warmth from a city one quiet degree at a time. Within a year, Kensington Capital occupied 3 glass floors overlooking Park Avenue, and Adrian's calendar became crowded with investor galas, private flights, and dinners hosted by families who measured human value through old money and political influence. Zariah tried to belong inside that world for him. She learned which fork to use at charity banquets. She stood beside him in designer gowns she secretly hated because they never felt like her. She smiled politely when wealthy women asked where she had come from, in tones that sounded less like curiosity and more like accusation. But every night when they returned home, Adrian still found her sitting cross-legged on the apartment floor, grading community center essays, while old jazz records played softly beside the windows. She remained the only thing in his life untouched by performance. That was exactly why Adrian's mother despised her. Eleanor Kensington had spent decades building the family name into a symbol respected from Manhattan to London. To her, love was acceptable only when it strengthened legacy. Zariah represented unpredictability, emotion, humanity, things Eleanor considered dangerous. Adrian still remembered the icy silence that filled the dining room the first time he brought Zariah to the Kensington estate in Connecticut. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath chandeliers, while snow fell softly outside the mansion windows. Zariah wore a simple dark green dress and carried herself with graceful calm despite the tension surrounding her. Eleanor studied her across the table with a smile too polished to be sincere. "So tell me, Zariah," she asked while cutting into her salmon, "what exactly are your long-term ambitions?" Adrian heard the hidden meaning immediately. What do you plan to become besides Adrian's mistake? But Zariah answered without fear. "I want to open literacy programs for children in underserved neighborhoods." Eleanor's lips curved slightly. How admirable. The words sounded like charity instead of respect. Adrian should have defended her more fiercely that night. Instead, he stayed silent to keep peace inside a family already pressuring him about investors and public image. It became the first crack in something once unbreakable. Weeks later, Kensington Capital faced a crisis after a merger nearly collapsed overseas. Adrian was forced to fly to London for emergency negotiations expected to last only 4 days. The night before his departure, rain tapped softly against the apartment windows while Zariah stood beside the kitchen counter watching him pack. "Promise me success is not going to change who you are," she whispered quietly. Adrian walked toward her immediately, wrapping his arms around her waist as the city lights glowed gold behind them. "You are the only thing reminding me who I am," he told her honestly. She smiled then, but sadness lingered inside her eyes like a warning he failed to understand. 2 days after Adrian arrived in London, Eleanor Kensington invited Zariah to lunch at a private club overlooking Central Park. The conversation lasted less than 40 minutes. By the end of it, Zariah sat frozen beneath the soft piano music while an envelope rested untouched beside her water glass. Inside was enough money to disappear and never contact Adrian again. Eleanor's voice remained calm and elegant as she delivered the final blow. "You may love my son," she said quietly, "but his future will never survive your presence." That same evening, Adrian called Zariah repeatedly from London. Every call went unanswered. Then just before midnight, a single message finally appeared on his phone. "I think we want different lives now. Please do not come looking for me." Adrian stared at those words for hours while rain fell over London, and somewhere back in New York, Zariah sat alone in darkness with trembling hands resting over the secret heartbeat already growing inside her. The first time Zariah heard both babies cry at once, she sat alone in a hospital room overlooking the gray February skyline of Brooklyn while snow drifted quietly beyond the windows like pieces of a world growing colder by the hour. Micah arrived 7 minutes before Mila, both tiny and beautiful, and carrying the same storm-gray eyes that haunted her memories every single morning. The nurse smiled softly as she placed the twins into Zariah's trembling arms. "They look just like their father," she whispered kindly. Zariah only lowered her eyes toward the blankets because some truths hurt too deeply to speak aloud. The following years became a blur of exhaustion wrapped inside love. Her apartment in Bedford-Stuyvesant was barely 700 square feet with old radiators that hissed loudly during winter nights and kitchen cabinets that refused to close properly. But somehow Zariah turned the space into something warm. Tiny sneakers lined the hallway. Finger paintings covered the refrigerator. Books stacked beside the couch because bedtime stories mattered more to her than sleep. During the day, she worked at a nonprofit literacy center, helping children learn to read. At night, she graded papers at the kitchen table, while the twins slept beside her beneath soft yellow lamplight. There were difficult weeks when bills piled too high and subway delays made her late for daycare pickup. Sometimes she skipped dinner so the twins could have fresh fruit instead of canned food. Yet no matter how hard life became, Zariah never allowed bitterness to enter the home she built for her children. Especially not bitterness toward Adrian. "Tell us about Daddy again," Mila would ask almost every Sunday morning while sitting cross-legged on the rug in pink pajamas clutching her stuffed rabbit. Zariah always smiled before answering because she refused to let pain become inheritance. "Your father was the kind of man who noticed lonely people," she would say softly. "He used to buy coffee for strangers during snowstorms." Micah loved those stories most. The little boy inherited Adrian's quiet intensity, always observing the world carefully before speaking. "Do you think he would like us?" he asked once while helping Zariah carry groceries upstairs. The question nearly broke her heart. She knelt slowly beside him in the dim apartment hallway and brushed his curls gently from his forehead. "He would love you more than anything," she whispered honestly. Because despite everything, Zariah never doubted that part. Across Manhattan, Adrian Kensington's face appeared constantly on television screens, inside airport lounges, and financial news programs. Magazine covers praised his billion-dollar acquisitions and disciplined leadership style. Women photographed beside him wore diamonds and couture gowns beneath flashing cameras. Yet every time Zariah accidentally saw his face, something inside her chest tightened with quiet grief, because the man smiling beside politicians and celebrities looked nothing like the exhausted young dreamer who once danced with her barefoot in a tiny apartment kitchen. Then, 3 months ago, headlines exploded across New York announcing Adrian's engagement to Charlotte Beaumont. The wedding of the year. Billionaire finance meets American media royalty. Zariah stared at the article for nearly 10 minutes after the twins fell asleep one rainy night. The photograph showed Adrian standing beside Charlotte beneath crystal lights, handsome and composed as always. But his smile never reached his eyes. Zariah touched the screen gently before turning the phone face down on the kitchen table. Outside, rain tapped softly against the apartment windows while inside the next room. 2 children who carried Adrian Kensington's eyes slept peacefully without knowing their father was preparing to marry someone else. By the time Adrian Kensington finally stepped inside St. Bartholomew's Cathedral, the wedding guests had already begun whispering behind polished smiles and champagne glasses. Rainwater darkened the shoulders of his black tuxedo as organ music echoed softly beneath the cathedral's towering ceilings. Charlotte Beaumont stood near the altar in a breathtaking white gown surrounded by candlelight and orchids, looking every bit like the woman newspapers called America's future queen of high society. Yet the moment her eyes landed on Adrian, something inside her expression shifted. Charlotte had spent 3 years beside powerful men. She understood the subtle language of wealth better than most people understood words themselves. She knew how to recognize ambition, ego, fear, and performance hidden beneath perfect tailoring and expensive watches. What she saw in Adrian now was something entirely different. Guilt. During the ceremony rehearsal the night before, Adrian had recited every vow flawlessly without once losing composure. Today his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his cufflinks. His gaze drifted constantly toward the cathedral doors as though part of him still stood somewhere else entirely. Charlotte stepped closer while guests settled quietly into their seats beneath stained glass windows glowing with soft afternoon light. "What happened?" she asked in a low voice meant only for him. Adrian looked at her, but could not answer immediately because the image of 2 small children with storm gray eyes continued replaying inside his mind like a wound refusing to close. Charlotte studied him carefully. "This is not cold feet," she whispered. "You look heartbroken." The honesty in her voice nearly made things worse. Charlotte Beaumont had always been elegant, intelligent, composed. She deserved truth, yet Adrian suddenly realized he no longer understood what truth even looked like inside the ruins of his carefully constructed life. Before he could respond, his best friend and legal advisor Daniel Mercer approached quietly, holding a slim manila envelope. "You asked me to move quickly," Daniel said under his breath. "The private investigator confirmed the information you requested." Adrian's chest tightened instantly. Charlotte noticed the exchange, but said nothing as Daniel discreetly handed over the sealed envelope before disappearing back into the crowd. Heavy cream-colored paper. No logo. No unnecessary words. Adrian stared at it as organ music continued floating through the cathedral. His pulse thundered beneath the silence. "What is that?" Charlotte asked softly. Adrian swallowed hard. "Something I should have discovered years ago." He stepped away toward a private dressing room near the side corridor while guests remained unaware behind cathedral doors. Inside the quiet room, rain tapped gently against stained glass windows as Adrian loosened his tie with shaking fingers. For several seconds, he simply stared at the envelope resting against the marble counter. The entire world seemed suspended between one breath and the next. Finally, he opened it. Inside were photographs first. Zariah walking the twins to school in Brooklyn. Micah sitting on her shoulders laughing beneath autumn leaves. Mila asleep against Zariah's chest on a subway ride. Then Adrian saw the birth certificates. Father listed, unknown. His vision blurred slightly. At the bottom rested the final document Daniel had rushed through a discreet laboratory only hours earlier using DNA samples collected from Adrian's hairbrush and a coffee cup retrieved after the street encounter. Adrian unfolded the report slowly while the distant sound of wedding guests greeting one another echoed beyond cathedral walls. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. The words stared back at him with devastating simplicity. Adrian lowered himself onto the leather bench beside the window as rain continued falling across Manhattan. Outside the cathedral, cameras waited for the wedding of the year. Inside a quiet dressing room, a billionaire finally realized that the most important part of his life had spent 5 years growing up without him. The cathedral doors opened precisely at noon, and every guest rose to their feet as Charlotte Beaumont began walking slowly down the white marble aisle beneath a ceiling glowing with candlelight and stained glass. Cameras flashed softly near the entrance while a string quartet played somewhere behind the towering floral arrangements. To the outside world, the moment looked perfect. America's most eligible billionaire waiting at the altar beside one of Manhattan's most admired women. Yet Adrian Kensington stood frozen beneath the cathedral lights, feeling as though his entire life had split into two separate futures, and only one of them contained truth. Charlotte moved gracefully toward him, her satin gown trailing behind like silver water across the marble floor. She looked stunning, elegant, calm. But as she reached the altar, her eyes searched Adrian's face once more and finally found the answer she had feared from the moment he walked into the cathedral soaked in rain and silence. The priest began speaking softly about love, commitment, and sacred promises while guests listened with approving smiles. Adrian barely heard a single word. All he could see were photographs spread across the dressing room counter upstairs. Micah laughing beside a school backpack. Mila asleep holding a worn stuffed rabbit. 5 birthdays. 5 Christmas mornings. 5 years of scraped knees, bedtime stories, nightmares, laughter, and tiny everyday moments he had missed because somewhere along the way he chose ambition over instinct and silence over love. Adrian. Charlotte's voice pulled him back gently. The priest had reached the vows. Hundreds of eyes watched expectantly beneath the cathedral chandeliers. Adrian looked toward Charlotte, and for the first time since meeting her, he allowed himself to be completely honest. "I cannot do this," he said quietly. The words landed softly but shattered through the cathedral louder than thunder. A ripple of confusion swept through the guests while camera flashes suddenly stopped. Charlotte remained perfectly still, though heartbreak flickered briefly across her composed expression. "Is there someone else?" she asked carefully, her voice low enough to preserve what dignity remained between them. Adrian lowered his gaze for one painful second before answering. There were always 3 someone else's. Silence swallowed the cathedral whole. Charlotte stared at him, confused at first, until understanding slowly entered her eyes. "Children." Adrian's voice trembled slightly as he continued. "I discovered today that I have twins. 5-year-old twins who grew up believing I abandoned them." Gasps echoed quietly throughout the crowd. Eleanor Kensington's face turned pale beneath the cathedral lights while Daniel Mercer looked away toward the windows. Charlotte inhaled slowly, holding herself together with visible effort. "Did you know?" she whispered. "No," Adrian answered immediately. "But I should have." Charlotte closed her eyes briefly as though mourning something she had sensed long before today. When she finally looked back at Adrian, there was sadness in her expression, but also unexpected compassion. "You are not standing here because you love me," she said softly. Adrian could not lie anymore. "I care about you deeply," he admitted. "But I think part of me stopped living the day I lost them." Charlotte nodded once, elegant even in heartbreak. Then slowly, with thousands of silent eyes watching, she stepped backward from the altar. "Then go find the part of you that is still worth saving," she whispered. Adrian stared at her with gratitude and grief colliding inside his chest. Then, without another word, he removed the wedding band from his trembling hand and placed it gently beside the bouquet of white roses before turning away from the altar. Outside the cathedral, rain still fell over Manhattan as Adrian Kensington walked past flashing cameras, shocked reporters, and the ruins of the life he had spent years building because somewhere in Brooklyn, 2 children with his eyes were waiting without even knowing it. Brooklyn looked different at night than the polished version of New York Adrian Kensington knew from penthouse windows and private rooftops. Here the streets glowed with small grocery signs, crowded diners, laundromats humming beneath yellow lights, and apartment windows carrying ordinary lives behind thin curtains. Rain still clung to the sidewalks as Adrian stepped out of a black SUV 3 blocks away from Zariah's building, because for the first time in years he did not want security teams or cameras surrounding him. He wanted to arrive as nothing more than a man who had already lost too much time. The address from Daniel's report led him to a narrow brownstone with chipped front steps and flower pots sitting carefully along the windowsills despite the cold October weather. One small apartment light still glowed on the 3rd floor. Adrian stood motionless for several seconds, staring upward, while his heartbeat pounded harder than it ever had during billion-dollar negotiations. Somewhere behind those walls his children were breathing, laughing, living entire lives without him. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last. Outside apartment 3B, he noticed tiny chalk drawings fading near the doorway. Stars. Smiling stick figures. A crooked heart. Children lived here. His children. Adrian raised his hand to knock, then stopped when he heard soft piano music drifting faintly through the door. Not polished concert music. Simple notes played carefully by small hands learning one key at a time. Something inside his chest nearly collapsed beneath the sound. Finally he knocked gently. Footsteps approached. The door opened halfway, and a little boy looked up at him with sleepy gray eyes beneath messy curls. Adrian forgot how to breathe. Micah blinked curiously at the tall stranger, standing frozen in the hallway wearing a rain-darkened tuxedo that suddenly looked painfully out of place beside the warmth of the apartment behind him. "Mom," Micah called softly without looking away from Adrian. "There is a man here." Adrian's throat tightened instantly because the child's voice sounded younger than he imagined, and somehow more real than anything the DNA report could ever prove. Then Micah tilted his head slightly, studying Adrian's face with innocent confusion. "Mom," he whispered again, "why does he look like us?" The question shattered whatever composure Adrian still had left. Behind the boy, Zariah appeared carrying a folded blanket in her arms. The moment her eyes landed on Adrian, all color drained from her face. Silence filled the apartment doorway while rain tapped quietly against distant windows and soft piano music continued somewhere inside the room. Mila appeared beside her brother, clutching the stitched stuffed rabbit against her chest. She stared openly at Adrian with wide gray eyes that mirrored his own so perfectly it almost hurt to look at her. Adrian lowered himself slowly onto one knee in the narrow hallway, because suddenly standing felt impossible beneath the weight of everything he had missed. His voice broke before the words fully escaped. "I did not know," he whispered. Zariah's eyes filled instantly, though she fought to remain composed for the children watching beside her. Adrian looked at Micah, then Mila, then back at Zariah. 5 years, he said quietly, grief cracking through every syllable. "I lost 5 years with them." For a moment nobody moved. Then Mila stepped forward first with the fearless curiosity only children possess. She studied Adrian carefully before lifting the stuffed rabbit toward him. "Its ear broke," she explained softly. "Mom fixed it." Adrian stared at the small rabbit with stitched fabric and trembling little hands holding it together. Something inside him finally broke open completely because no business victory, No cathedral wedding, no empire he had ever built could compare to the heartbreaking beauty of a child offering trust before understanding pain. 1 year later, the first light of autumn spilled gently across the windows of a Brooklyn townhouse filled with the kind of warmth money alone could never buy. The scent of cinnamon pancakes drifted through the kitchen while old jazz music played softly from a speaker resting beside a row of children's books and framed finger paintings. Outside, golden leaves moved slowly along the sidewalks beneath the quiet Sunday morning sun. Inside the house, laughter echoed where silence and regret had once lived. Adrian Kensington stood barefoot near the stove wearing a gray sweater and jeans instead of tailored suits and diamond cufflinks. His billion-dollar empire still existed somewhere beyond Manhattan bridges and financial headlines, but it no longer owned every part of him. Micah sat at the upright piano near the living room window, carefully practicing scales with fierce concentration, while Mila rested sideways across the couch coloring stars onto construction paper beside her repaired stuffed rabbit. "Daddy," Mila called suddenly without looking up. "You burned the pancakes again." Adrian laughed softly while turning toward the skillet. "That is because your brother distracted me with dramatic piano music." "It is Beethoven," Micah corrected seriously, though the corners of his mouth lifted exactly the way Adrian's always had. Across the kitchen, Zariah leaned against the counter holding a coffee mug between her hands as sunlight touched the soft caramel tones of her sweater. For a moment, Adrian simply looked at her quietly, because after everything they had survived, peace still felt almost unbelievable. The months after the wedding had not been simple. There were painful conversations, apologies that arrived years too late. Trust rebuilt slowly through ordinary moments instead of grand gestures. Adrian attended school pickups between investor meetings. He learned bedtime routines, favorite breakfast cereals, and how Mila needed a nightlight shaped like the moon to sleep peacefully. He sat through parent-teacher conferences with more nervousness than corporate negotiations. And every single night, no matter how exhausted he became, Adrian thanked God silently for the privilege of hearing his children call him Dad before falling asleep. Zariah never asked him to abandon his empire. She only asked him to stop abandoning himself. Somehow that changed everything. Newspapers still occasionally discussed the billionaire who walked away from the wedding of the decade, but eventually Manhattan found newer scandals to chase. Adrian no longer cared, because the greatest thing he had ever built was not displayed on financial reports or magazine covers. It lived here instead, in sticky syrup-covered fingers, in piano notes drifting through warm morning light, in tiny shoes by the doorway and bedtime laughter echoing down narrow hallways. Adrian carried a plate of pancakes toward the table just as Mila wrapped her arms around his waist unexpectedly. "Are you staying home today?" she asked softly. Adrian knelt beside her immediately, brushing a curl gently from her forehead. "Always," he answered without hesitation. Across the room, Zariah watched him with quiet tears shining in her eyes while sunlight filled the little Brooklyn home they had once believed life was too cruel to give them. And for the first time in many years, Adrian Kensington finally understood that love was never supposed to feel like power. It was supposed to feel like coming home.